So now we're going to talk about transition. Transitions is going from one scene to another. A simple transition might be, meanwhile, back at the ranch, or even, meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice, or 3 days later. This statement grounds the reader in the change in time, place, or even viewpoint. However, if you're taking the same viewpoint character and shifting them between scenes, you need these scenes to logically connect with each other. So this is where sequels come in. Yay, sequels! I'm terrible at them. I know the reason, I know the point, and I tend to forget them at everywhere except the end of the chapters. And boom, I gotta add them. I do a pretty decent job of doing the end of chapters with a good sequel hook. Sometimes I don't, but most of the time I'm pretty good at it. A sequel is what happens after the disaster occurs. The sequel moves the reader and the character to the next scene, and the sequel has 4 basic parts. So let's discuss each one. Emotion, which is, oddly enough, an emotion. Obviously, you need to show and or tell the emotional reaction to the disaster outcome. You can describe the emotion using your words. You can use the examples of the emotion they are feeling, such as, their skin is bright red, or, they suddenly are grinding their teeth. But be clear and don't be coy about it. Show the emotion with strong language that conveys the meaning. You can also have the character discuss that emotion with another character. The character needs to be honest and really show the emotion, show the reaction, even if the dialogue says otherwise. The emotion needs to be really felt, heartfelt, so that your reader is really invested in your character. The disaster is the stimulus, the emotion is the reaction. Thought. This is the character's inner monologue about the disaster and their emotion about it. And they might talk about it to another character through dialogue, but sometimes, most of the time, it's an inner thing. They want to review their story goal. Do they still want it after that terrible disaster? They may look at their own actions, deny they had any fault, or they may learn from those disastrous happenings and might start figuring out what their flaws are. They may restate the story goal and think about what it means to them, and then they need to figure out what they're going to do, and thus we slide into decision. Decision. The decision is a short-term goal that leads to the story goal. It's essentially the new goal in the next scene they're going to work for. Thus, the next scene is right in sight, and the goal needs to be clear so you can transition, move to that next scene, and this prepares the reader for that next scene. It explains what the purpose is and what is happening and why it's happening. So therefore, you have emotion, thought, decision that leads to action. Action is your character actually doing the action of getting that goal. They're going to travel to the place to do it. They're going to call somebody up to get it. Whatever it is they're doing, they're working toward that next goal. They need to have another statement of goal and purpose in that next scene. And don't necessarily always be using telling somebody or internal monologue. They can write it down. They can text it to somebody. Use different ways of making that action become the new goal. Then they might walk towards the next scene yelling, "I'm mad and I'm not going to take it anymore." And so therefore you're using all the parts of this transition into the next scene, so that way it really can build your next scene up. Sequel variants. If you skip any one of those parts, you skip the thought, you skip the decision, you need to add it in back later. You can do that in a flashback or have the character discuss about what emotion led them to that thought. Perhaps the last scene was a combat scene. They didn't have time to use the thought decision but went straight to action. Then you might want to have them tell their sidekick later that they thought they were going to lose the princess, so they just had to jump in the pit after her. Let's discuss scene and sequel variations that can help. Goal is obvious, like don't die in a flaming pit of doom. So if you have a very clear goal, you know, it's pretty obvious what kind of thing you can do. If you're trying to shock and confuse the reader, which is an advanced technique that I would suggest being careful about, have the hero state their goal after the scene happened because it was just that fast and quick and they had to do it. They ran into a room, killed a room full of nobles, and afterwards they're telling the princess they were going to kill the king, so I had to make sure they wouldn't. Number 2, have the disaster be delayed or set off to go at a time later. Yes, you got the diamond, but the diamond has an antimatter magnetic crystal lattice that will explode when shocked by electricity, and you're on a crazy train that's about to hit a supercell thunderstorm. Right? So you got your goal, but it's going to destroy you possibly later. Another scene interrupts the current scene. So number 3, perhaps you have an ambush, bandits attack, tornado happens. You have to resolve that first pressing conflict before you can get into the next scene or finish it. Number 4, change in goals or tactics due to an emotional response, thought, or decision. Your hero realizes that the sword of her father means so much, but if the evil emperor gets it, then the evil emperor will control everything. Thus, rather than fighting, she throws the sword into the volcano. Sounds a little familiar. Number 5, change the goal, conflict, disaster order, but don't make it too confusing or you can end up with a scene that's very muddled. It might pull the reader out of the story because they're more concentrating on your structural differences than your most normal scenes. A list of some sequel structure variations. Number 1, if the action or conflict is immediate and time is of the essence, then just have the parts of the sequel be a few words or just one word. That speeds things along. Number 2, if you really need one part to resonate, then build it up. Build the emotional part to be really strong and really impactful. Number 3, change the normal line of emotion, thought, decision, action to cause confusion to generate conflict in the character and tension in the reader. Perhaps the hero is evaluating their past problems and learning something. Number 4, scene interruption with another scene. This can speed up the pace or keep the hero from figuring things out. You can have the scenes combine, so it ends up being one scene, one goal, one disaster at the end. Number 5, add a flashback or past scenes in part like an emotion or thought or decision to emphasize what the story goal is, why they're still going for it, even when a disaster occurs. Using sequels to speed up a story. Number 1, shove 2 scenes together and skip the sequel, link them together in a logical sense, but just keep it moving. Number 2, use sequels to speed things along by making it very quick, 1 or 2 words, a compound sentence, that's it. Number 3, boil your words and the message that you're trying to use. Don't be flowery, just to the point, boom, make it hit. Number 4, raise the stakes of the conflict or add complications to the conflict. Number 5, add secondary conflicts that arise from the core conflict due to side characters or side plots. Number 6, don't flinch away from the disaster. Make them serious, make them hurt. Number 7, make the disasters so important that they have to be resolved now, and that moves the story goal back even further. 8, change the motivations of the protagonist or even the antagonist to address story questions now rather than later and move up the timeline altogether. Use sequels to slow down your story. Number 1. Cut a scene short and start the sequel, especially mid-conflict. It's mild, not that big of a deal. Cut it out, keep it going. Number 2. Have the conflict happen and end sooner so you get a longer sequel sequence. Number 3. Start the scene mid-conflict so the sequel isn't as intense as the conflict and make it hurt. Number 4, More character internalizations like the emotion, thought, decision that break up the scenes currently from past scenes. And so they're constantly flashing back and thinking about the things that happened previously. Number 5. Give more story time between intense conflicts. So that conflict kind of changes between super intense to less intense ones, and so it feels like a roller coaster, and there's a little bit more space between the really hardcore ones. Number 6. Review more about the emotions, thoughts from the current disaster, and kind of review it, have them go over it. They're ruminating about it. It really hurts. Number 7. Have obstacles that aren't disaster worthy that come before the conflict even takes place. They're on the road to the mountain, but then they got a flat tire. Things like that. Number 8. Muddy the scene by having the antagonist reverse their tactics. They leave, or really there is no definite goal. They're trying to figure out what the goal is. Here are some advanced scene techniques. Scene interruption, number 1. You postpone the current scene with another. I like having them come together or split apart, but a nice option also is to double the disasters for more suffering and pain. Number 2, scene inside the ending sequel. Have a flashback backstory in the emotion or thought part. This will heighten the emotion, especially perhaps a lost character or current character pushes them to a decision and action because of the emotional weight of what happened previously. Number 3, have 2 scenes back to back without a sequel, but then the disasters compound the emotion, lead to bigger thoughts of the first scene and the first problem. Number 4, non-viewpoint character starts the scene, a new subplot or side character walks in with a whole new perspective. This can be a good break, or it can really push that conflict up to 11. 4A, let's explain a little bit about examples of this. The sidekick gets captured by the villain, the villain's going to kill him. The villain gains their power crystal, now they are unstoppable. The villain has their own disaster, which makes them hate the hero even more. Number 5, flashbacks, especially in the thought portion of the sequel. You summarize the flashback, make it kind of small, but it's a punch to increase the disaster suffering from previous disasters. Number 6, scene fragmentation. You use a flashback or memory to heighten the emotion part of the sequel. Number 7, all dialogue scene. Keep the viewpoints clear, keep the physical and internal emotions in the sequel clear. However, this can break up if you have a lot of action or a lot of traveling. Use that to break up the monotony. This can save a scene when it is a long trek through a boring wilderness, or they're doing some mundane task. Just make sure you keep the dialogues clear of who's saying what. Number 8, all action scenes. On the other hand, having little dialogue and all internalization can be a good idea to break things up as well if this scene is mostly action and responses. Number 9, a unseen or unknown opponent. Very helpful when the actual antagonist is the environment, but also a hidden villain. Their hero has no idea what's coming and how to fight it or how to achieve their goal. Therefore, they have to figure things out, and they use emotion less. Number 10, many people, many viewpoints, many goals. Not actual viewpoints in the story, but the idea is everybody's trying to compete against each other to obtain their goal, and your hero may have one person who is ally, several people that are kind of for him and kind of against him, and then 3 or 4 people that are absolutely against him. You muddy all this up until the climax of the scene, and you keep the ideas clear, but you have a lot of mini victories, mini disasters until the very end. We've talked about sentence structure that leads to scenes. We've talked about how to connect scenes. We've talked about how to change things around to speed up, slow, or change around your story. Now let's talk about a bunch of mistakes that I've made. Here are a bunch of scene errors. Number one, done this a million times, too many people in a scene. The conflict is all over the place. Dialogue is confusing. If there is a conflict, it's not very clear. The whole thing is out of focus. Narrow the conflict to just a few people to really increase that conflict and understanding what is actually going on in the scene. Number two, circular arguments. This isn't a Monty Python skit, so if it's just yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, that's kind of boring unless it's got John Cleese in it. Number three, interruptions that are pointless. Real life has all kinds of pointless interruptions. I've had a bunch of them filling right now, but books are logical and should not be completely boring with absolute mundane inanities. Random should be obvious and foreshadowed, that way a clever reader can figure it out. Number four, going off the rails like a crazy train. Don't let all kinds of new angles of conflict, side characters, even the villain run your story into a ditch. Keep the goal in the scene in mind. Keep the overarching story goal in mind as well. Number five, summarize things. You've heard it, you know it. Show, don't tell. It's fine to skip 10 days of boring travel with nothing going on with just one line. However, don't skip your conflict, the disaster, or stating your goal. Put in the work into the scene, put that work into the emotion, thought, decision, and action. It'll help a ton. It'll keep your readers invested in your story. Number six, forgetting viewpoint. Don't forget whose story this is, whose chapter this is, whose scene this is. If you're like me and you end up writing something and you forget whose viewpoint you're doing, you might end up writing the villain story, which worked out, but it was a complete accident. Number seven, don't forget your goal. Make sure your reader doesn't forget the goal. Make sure your hero doesn't forget your goal. Even with other interruptions and crazy things going on, your hero should know what's going on and they should pick up the goal and the story goal, more importantly, later, because that disaster happened. Now they're even more determined to get it done. Number eight, your conflict is boring. If the antagonist doesn't care about your conflict, your hero doesn't care about your conflict, then the reader's not going to care about your conflict. Number nine, the disagreement should have a reason. If your antagonist says no, then there should be a good, interesting reason why. Number 10, unfair odds. If the antagonist is so overpowered, then it's pointless and we know what's going to happen. And if the hero does win, it's not that believable. And here's why villains monologue all the time, because it's a flag of bad writing and they're giving the hero a chance. Number 11, purple prose internalizations. If you're writing erotica, romance, go for it. That's what that's for. If you're not writing those types of stories, then if you make everything overblown, especially in your emotion, in your thought, then it becomes a little too much. You need to keep things moving and make it appropriate for the genre you're writing. Number 12, no stakes. No, I'm not talking about eating steaks or killing vampires with stakes. There's no point in your conflict. Why does your hero even bother? Why don't they just walk away? Number 13 is communism, of course. No, communism is just a red herring. So don't put in threats that don't actually happen. Otherwise, your reader is going to wonder, why is this even in here? Don't make red herrings too much of the goal, conflict, and disaster. Otherwise, your reader is going to pick up on that and wonder where that story is, especially if that story is more important. Number 14, contrived disasters. In other words, it was all a dream. It's terrible. Readers are going to roll their eyes. Once in a blue moon, maybe it's okay, but it will turn your readers against you, and any future disaster or terrible thing that happens is going to be less believable, and they'll just go, it's probably just a dream. Why am I even reading this book? Chapters are just collections of scenes that eventually end. A sentence leads to a sequence leads to a scene leads to a sequel connects scenes. Many scenes are a chapter, and the chapters connect in an overarching book. I'm not going to go into chapter structure here because this script is already 42 pages long. The best chapter structure is to keep the tension going, keep the conflict going. The best place to end a chapter is usually at the disaster point with a real big gut punch. Maybe the emotion or thought, but you want to really put that part of the sequel in the beginning of that next chapter to keep the scene moving, and so the reader, if they did happen to put your book down, they can pick up and go, aha, this is why I'm continuing to read this. Keep your reader invested and keep them reading. That's the most important part. If you end a chapter with no tension, no conflict, no disaster, then you just literally told them to put the book down and they can go to sleep because your character's about to as well. I hope you enjoyed this super deep dive into the structural elements of fiction. Yes, this is one of my hardest problems. I tend to just write action, then action, then action, and don't go much beyond that, which is one of my problems. The idea of stopping the action to go into sequels and do all that work leaves me bored a lot of the time, which is why knowing this and using it to your advantage can really make your writing reach new heights and really keep the tension, conflict going, so your readers are really invested on keeping reading to the very bitter end. Thank you for watching this first ocean crossing deep dive into writing craft. I hope your creative endeavors bring you peace, love, and happiness.